Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, the commentary arm of Bloomberg News. And I'm here with two of my esteemed colleagues this morning, Andreas Kluth, a columnist who covers national security and diplomacy, and JP Spinetto, who's based in Mexico City and covers Latin American affairs for us. Today, we're going to try to bite off in the next 25 minutes a very important and multifaceted topic: U.S. military strikes off the coast of Venezuela. It's raised issues about the reason behind the strikes, U.S. drug policy, the possibility that war crimes were committed, and the United States' relationship not only with Venezuela, but with Latin America more broadly. So we'll jump right into it. And let's set the table here a little bit, Andreas. We're essentially talking about what's come out of two pairs of strikes. The first one in early September, on September 2nd, and a follow-up set of strikes in early October, October 6th. They've both spawned controversy and questions. And let's talk about that first strike, the September 2nd strike. What was the Trump administration's stated goal for those strikes, and what has emerged from them?
The first strike, early September, first of all, that was in the context of a very befuddling, surprising military buildup that has continued in the Caribbean that suggests there is a larger goal separate from the stated goal, the larger goal being regime change. Those two things have been conflated the whole time. The stated goal since September 2nd was that the U.S. is now in a so-called non-international state of war or combat, is their phrase chosen by the administration's lawyers, against narco traffickers. So essentially...
In Venezuela.
Well, in general. And this is another conflation between those two war goals, or there is, of course, an emergency, a drug epidemic in America. It mainly has to do with fentanyl, which comes from China through Mexico to the U.S. and has nothing to do with Venezuela. There is another drug epidemic that has largely to do with cocaine, which comes from Colombia via the Pacific routes to America, also does not really involve Venezuela. So this is another source of befuddlement, which is why everyone I have talked to is just assumes as a matter of course that this narco trafficking stated goal is a pretext for something else. But so we have that pretext, and the administration started bombing boats, speedboats, in one case a semi-submersible, and says the people on board were trafficking drugs, therefore we must kill them. They were about to harm Americans, and has essentially executed them. I've talked to a number of so-called JAGs, those are military lawyers, former military lawyers, and they actually, all of them have said very clearly, you often see that it's doubtful whether this is lawful. They also said these are extrajudicial executions, and the word they often used is murder, because these are not combatants.
Let's slow down a sec there, though.
Yeah.
You earlier mentioned that this is a pretext for something else, and that something else in this case is the Maduro regime in Venezuela, right?
Correct.
And the argument is that this is a stalking horse or an open door that would allow the Trump administration to essentially use the threat of military force to move Maduro out of office in Venezuela, right?
To pressure him to leave voluntarily or to attack. There are already, this is odd, Trump announced that there were covert operations already going on, which of course makes them overt operations. So there is this, and we should at some point, JP can also mention, we have this huge armada with the best aircraft carrier group in the world there. You don't do that for just a bunch of small civilian boats of narco traffickers. I should also mention out that up to this change in August, there was the change apparently, and another envoy in the Trump administration, Rick Grenell, was actually negotiating with Maduro, and that seemed to be promising. In other words, Maduro seemed to be ready to concede things that Trump may still take as a win and proclaim victory. That was going to happen anyway. We think that several factions within the Trump administration, in this case led by Marco Rubio, want regime change and want to use narco trafficking as the pretext for a decapitation strike or some other form of direct intervention to get
of course,
Maduro
Andreas,
out.
that force in the Caribbean is an expensive force to maintain, several $1 million a day in taxpayer money. It means they're also not elsewhere in the world where there are hotspots, particularly the South China Sea and the Mediterranean. JP, how do Venezuelans view this, and how does the rest of Latin America view this in its current state?
So we need to first start with the fact that Maduro is hated pretty much in the whole region, right? So
and why? Why is he hated?
Well, it's a terrible dictatorship. It has sunk the Venezuelan economy 80%. And also, it has expelled all 8 million Venezuelans. A lot of them went to live in other South American or Latin American countries. So for the region, they could see with their own eyes the trouble of the Maduro dictatorship. Last year, he stole this election. That was pretty clear. So we get to this point where...
And JP, also remark on the fact that Venezuela sits atop untapped petroleum reserves.
Yes, it's the largest reserves of oil in the world. And also, let's remember, Trump already tried to unseat Maduro in 2019 and he failed, right? So what is the view from the region? We did a poll in Bloomberg a month ago with Atlas Intel, and that poll shows that 53% of Latin Americans support a U.S. military intervention to remove Maduro, with 35 opposing it. Now, I think the reason for this is the hate that Latin Americans have against Maduro. Now, what is the institutional or political response from the region? It has been surprisingly quiet, and it has a reason why. Nobody wants to fight with Trump, and they have their own interests, and not a lot of these governments wants to stand up against what we are seeing in terms of this military buildup. For instance, Mexico is a leftist government. The president historically has argued that they are against intervention. They have a history with the U.S. itself, but so far it hasn't said anything because obviously the economic relationship between Mexico and the U.S. is paramount. Brazil, Lula, historically an ally of Maduro. He greeted Maduro 2 years ago in Brasilia, treated like a hero. And today he is negotiating with Trump the removal of these tariffs. So he hasn't said anything publicly, at least, beyond the appeals for peace. We need to also see the right-wing turn that the region is doing. We saw it with the Milei election, midterm election in October. We saw it in Chile. We saw it this weekend in Honduras, where the leftist candidate ended up third in the election. And we're probably going to see it next year in Colombia, Peru, maybe even in Brazil. So we have seen this tacit or even explicit in some cases, like in the case of Milei, support to the intervention of Trump. We have to see what happens now, right? I think we are in a key moment, and we are not very sure what is the end game here.
Andreas, one of the things that has emerged over the last week, and really is boiling as we speak, is a lack of clarity about a follow-up strike on September 2nd that killed fishermen from a boat that had been sunk who were still alive in the water. There's an issue as whether or not that amounts to a war crime, because at that point they were non-combatants, as the definition goes. It originally was reported last week that Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, had ordered that they be killed when he was made aware that they were still alive in the water. The White House has since said that the order actually came from Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley. Though there's still some back and forth around the sequencing, the origination of the first order to do this, where there was the chain of command and all this.
Right.
That is so murky that Republicans in both the House and the Senate, who oversee relevant committees that investigate such matters, plan to investigate this. And they, of course, have support of Democrats. So there's a bipartisan push to know more. What do you make of all of that?
I make of all of that. Recall that the military lawyers I spoke to said that even just the strikes without this new revelation were unlawful because the people on board were civilians. It may be criminal. We don't know because we don't have the evidence, but maybe not. In one case after the strike,
the evidence meaning whether or not they actually were smuggling drugs.
Exactly. Just evidence, any evidence. And the White House has not given even Congress any evidence. In the specific case, this is sort of worse because Hegseth denies a lot of this. And as you said, there's back and forth. But essentially, this was the first strike, and he said, kill everybody. Admiral Bradley said, okay, well, with our drone strikes, there was a first volley. It blew up the boat, and there was debris. And then they discovered there were 2 survivors in the water floating. Remember, all the others were also not technically combatants in international law. Now there are 2 survivors, and Admiral Bradley went in with ordered a second volley that then killed them. And this, we have to wait for the full fact pattern, but would be a war crime as defined ever since the Nuremberg trials. Okay, so that's the fact pattern of that, and that would, of course, I should add one interesting detail after that. In subsequent strikes, there were sometimes survivors, and this is interesting. There was one strike where there was a Colombian and an Ecuadorian survivor, and the administration then picked them up out of the water, as it always has done when it used to be the Coast Guard making arrests of these boats and then handing them over for prosecution. That's what you're supposed to do. In this case, they must have figured out that the first strike was probably excessive, but then
we don't know. We don't know what inspired them to pick up survivors after October 6th. But what we certainly know is they handled it very differently than the September 2nd strike.
But I want to make one additional point. They handed these 2, the Colombian to Colombia and the Ecuadorian to Ecuador, where they were released. There was no evidence that their own government said. So also, why do you hand them over if you have evidence? Why wouldn't you then prosecute?
Meaning there was no evidence of drug smuggling.
None that the public is aware of.
Okay. JP, there's so much in this and what you said prior to this, but about the rightward turn across Latin America. Voters, I think, upset with a number of salient issues, including first and foremost, probably just their economic well-being. Does the fact that this has all gotten very murky, that what was nominally, a drug patrol off the coast of Venezuela with an unusual amount of American firepower behind it, where people were willing to accept that if it resulted in possibly accept it if it resulted in regime change in Venezuela. Does the fact that the more we learn about this, as Andreas just laid out, around whether or not the boats were even involved in drug smuggling, whether or not innocents were killed by U.S. forces, and whether or not there's so much being focused on interdicting the drug trade, and Maduro is still in power, that Venezuelans and or others in Latin America are just going to lose patience with this?
So I think we need to separate the attack on allegedly drug traffickers and Maduro, right? Something that the administration isn't doing, by the way. But this idea of fighting drug traffickers is quite popular in Latin America because the region is also suffering from this. It's not just the U.S. We see an increase in violence across the region. We see that violence is top of their minds in voters in countries like here, Mexico, for instance, or in Brazil, in other countries as well. We just had that Chile election, and it was the number one issue, insecurity. So I think this security populism, if we can call it that way, resonates with some voters at least. Now, the issue is that one thing is doing this. Another very different thing is what's your end game with Venezuela? And the reality is that we don't know what is that end game. We think that the goal is regime change, indeed, even though the Trump administration is selling it as a war on the narcos. But I think it's going to be rated by the results. And we don't know yet how this is going to unfold. I think we are in a situation now that with this massive build-up of military power in the Southern Caribbean, there is no other option for Trump than to use it. He cannot now go back home. And how he uses it and how this plays out in terms of taking Maduro out will be the defining moment and the defining element to be considered by voters.
Wait, I want to stop on that for a second, yeah. JP, and bring Andreas in. Andreas, do you think that what JP just said, that that Trump has no other choice but to use this, military force now that he's deployed it in the region? Do you agree with that?
I wrote a column on that because I had exactly that assumption, so I decided to test it by asking a few people. And there are theories. They're called path dependency, for instance, and one is called audience cost. So if someone, a leader, does such a buildup or signals in the language a force in such a way that he cannot back down because he would lose credibility at home and abroad. And so I asked the scholars who actually wrote that research like decades ago, and to my surprise, they said, well, Trump might break all our theories, because if you remember, he does this all the time. He goes back on his own word on anything, and I think by now he believes that he can get away with anything. He can say it's green, and tomorrow he says it's red, and then everyone says it was green all along. So maybe he could, and frankly, I think we should all almost conspire to help him, because it would be better. Because if he goes ahead and
meaning he could withdraw forces from the region.
Yes, it would be a huge fiasco. It would just be such a waste, as you said earlier. It's not just the direct cost to taxpayer; it's the opportunity cost of this force, which is something like almost 10% of the United States Navy. This force is not present in regions of the world where it is needed, because nobody has ever explained why the Caribbean, Central America was an imminent national security threat right now to the United States. These forces shouldn't be there. So he'd have to explain in a normal administration why he put us through this theater. But I think Trump has explained stranger and worse, or stranger things before.
But what he has explained here, they're most to unseating Maduro. The constant theme, and I want to come back to you on this, JP, has been that they want to snuff out the drug trade. But JP, this is also chaotic and I think improperly narrated by the White House. The White House has been very fixated on fentanyl coming to the United States, but as we know, that it's coming from China and transits through Mexico into the United States. It's not coming out of the Caribbean, and it's not coming out of the Pacific coast of South America. And then even if you look at what's coming out of Venezuela, the cocaine that is being shipped out of Venezuela is going to Europe. Most of it is going to Europe, not to the United States. And then the other wrinkle in all of this is that Trump has signaled that he plans to pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former Honduran president, who was convicted a year ago in a U.S. court in New York of essentially building a cocaine superhighway for trafficking to the United States. So if the White House is serious about drug interdiction, they certainly aren't helping the case by pardoning an architect of drug trafficking, a known architect of drug trafficking from Honduras. And what they're attempting to snuff out in Venezuela is not actually a current drug threat to the United States. So again, what do you think of this in terms of consistency? And then secondly, how do Latin Americans look at it?
So obviously, this pardon is very strange. It's very hard to explain how you, on one side, said that your policy and your goal, your number one goal almost is to eliminate all these narco traffickers, and at the same time, pardon someone who has been convicted for 45 years, for doing exactly that. I read several theories behind this. Maybe he tried to influence the Honduran elections. Maybe he is not doing it in the end. He just announced it. And as Andreas says, it's another example of something that he walks back. But certainly it doesn't look like a very consistent policy decision. Now, we go back to Venezuela. And what does it mean, all of this? I think what we need to see is that Maduro or Trump will lose here. So either Trump goes back home and says, we reach an agreement, or there's no need to use this military force, or Maduro is gone through that force. I think now we are in this moment, in this stalemate, that is going to be very interesting to see how it evolves. Because certainly one of the two, even if Trump can sell it as a change of mind, will be seen as the weaker hand here.
Andreas, is the White House going to see this through in your estimation? Are they going? I mean, we talked earlier about whether or not Trump would withdraw his military force. That's one element of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would stop trying to engage in regime change through other methods in Venezuela if they do that. Do you see the White House as hanging in there around this particular conflict, come heck or high water?
There's, again, the advisors, and there's Trump, and Trump will make the decision. I just want to, for instance, I hit one of his former national security advisors, John Bolton, I've talked to several times in the past few months, and says Trump does not think these things through. He's in it, and he's realizing that his own base, the MAGA base, doesn't want. I mean, he came to power in part by promising to end forever wars. There's no appetite among his supporters, he's figured out, to start another war with vague war goals. So I'm not sure he's eager for this. The question is, how do you get out of it? And so when you say following through, they'll have to resolve this somehow. And, there could be, if you think of Iran or the Houthis in Yemen, what could be a Trumpy solution is you bomb something quite spectacularly and you leave. Okay? Big flames, great news cycle. It's perfect reality television. We all write about it, and then it's over because you proclaim victory. If you go in harder, deeper, I think it's now dawned on everyone in the administration, because there is a lot of research, that both the history of American attempts at regime change is a uniformly bad one. It doesn't lead to good outcomes. And you could create a Libya. You could create another migration explosion where there is already a migration explosion, and refugees from. You could destabilize the entire region. I don't think they want to do that. I think they're hoping for Maduro to offer certain things. It could be oil, it could be leaving and going to Turkey. But I want to remind you what we said at the outset. Rick Grenell was negotiating with them, and it was going in that direction anyway.
Personally, there is a fantastic picture of him greeting Maduro at the beginning of the administration.
One other thing, Andreas, and I'll come back to you, JP. What does some of this suggest about Trump's relationship with the U.S. military? Obviously, there's been reports that Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, clashed with the White House during the October 6th strikes. In the wake of those, Admiral Alvin Halsey announced his resignation. He was head of military forces in the region. Is it strained to the breaking point at this point between the military command and the White House?
It's extremely strained. The breaking point would have to be defined. There's obviously no sign of insurrection, but there is Trump, who's always, since his first term, had if you remember what he said at Arlington Cemetery once, an ambiguous, to say the least, relationship with the military. And then there's his defense secretary, who I believe is no longer tenable. He was confirmed by one vote, and that was Vice President Vance. And several, even Republicans, have never liked him and may now turn against him.
Well, so, and Hegseth may have to go through a fairly brutal round of public interrogations on all of this too.
For sure. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's gone and someone like Dan Driscoll becomes the next defense secretary. But if you also remember the strained relationship, but the two of them, Hegseth ordered all generals and admirals, all the top brass from around the world to come to Quantico base just the other day, and gave him a very infantile lecture on essentially the warrior ethos. Like, he was lecturing these real warriors in front of him on basically how to do more push-ups and have harder abs. Mm-hmm. And then Trump said, well, that's great TV, so I'm going to give a speech too. And both of their speeches made them very uncomfortable, because they both attacked this core of 250 years of tradition, which is an apolitical military. Neither of them seems to believe that. And I think many, and all the JAGs, the lawyers, have told me that too. So it's very strained. A breaking point, I'm not sure how to define, but extremely strained.
But certainly strained. JP, how do you, and this is crystal ball gazing, and so, whatever we say here obviously could turn out to be incorrect. But as you see the lay of the land now, how do you see this getting resolved in the region?
So the issue is that Maduro also reads the stories that Andreas is mentioning, right? And he knows that this is happening. And he knows that for him to be removed, Trump needs to use that military force. There was a very interesting piece on the Miami Herald yesterday mentioning details of this call that the two had last week. And basically, Trump was saying that if he goes with his family immediately, he will be giving, certain reassurances. But the reality is that he's not alone. He has 2,000 generals. He has a political group that, controls the whole country. He has the military. So if he leaves, someone else will take over, and we want to have the same. I think Maduro is trying to call the bluff and see if Trump really wants to act. And to Andreas' point, maybe he fires a few missiles, hits Venezuela from afar, but that's not going to be enough for him to leave. The U.S. will have to remove him with military force, and that means, thousands and thousands of soldiers. So I think Maduro, unfortunately, has a strong case in that sense. Because he has that control.
JP Spinetto, Andreas Kluth, thank you for joining us today. This has been Bloomberg Opinions Politics live stream. This is an important and fast-moving topic. I'm sure we'll be back to talk about this again soon. I'm Tim O'Brien. Thank you for joining us today.